Can we talk about how Hack-A-Shaq is one of the most overrated defensive strategies in the modern NBA? If you don't know, the general idea behind the strategy is to target a player who is atrocious at free throw shooting, like Shaquille O'Neal, and fouling them relentlessly at the end of the game to force them to make free throws to win. Of course, the strategy didn't start with Shaq, it actually originated with Wilt Chamberlain. For everything Wilt did well, he was a poor free throw shooter, around 50% from the line for his career. Because he was so dominant everywhere else, teams would just foul him whether he had the ball or not. That led to an NBA rule change that essentially says you can't foul players who don't have the ball or aren't actively trying to get the ball, or else that player gets the free throws and his team retains possession. With that rule in the books, the practice was largely forgotten until 1997. At that point, the Chicago Bulls were basically unstoppable, but did have one weak link on offense: Dennis Rodman. That season, Rodman was making 38% of his free throws, so Dallas Mavericks head coach Don Nelson had his players foul Rodman toward the end of a game. Unfortunately for him, Rodman went 9 of 12 from the line and the practice again died for a bit. However, in 1999, Nelson used a strategy against Shaq, who, like Wilt, shot around 50% from the stripe for his career. The conventional wisdom claims that having Shaq take that low percentage shot was not only more likely to lead to a wasted possession for the Los Angeles Lakers, but also kept the clock stopped. And to be clear, it did work from time to time, particularly late in Shaq's career, as we'll discuss. It also does work against other players, but trying to do it against prime Shaq was almost always a mistake. There are several reasons why the strategy was mostly bupkis, but let's start with the actual shooting percentages. As mentioned above, Shaq was a career 50% from the line, and during his peak, sometimes even shot worse than that in the playoffs. In fact, his field goal percentage for his career is 56%, meaning he was shooting better from the field than from the line, which isn't great. The Lakers of that era generally shot right around 48% from two-point range and were a mostly average to poor three-point shooting team by percentage. So opposing teams are effectively trading a 50% chance of 2 points to give Shaq 1 point if we assume that he makes half of his shots from the line. Over a significant stretch, fouling Shaq is always the best option, statistically, which is why the strategy became popular. Job done, right? Well, unfortunately for people who claim that Shaq was, quote, unplayable in the last 2 minutes of a game, basketball is not a simulation. The first issue is actually pretty simple. During the Lakers' dominant three-peat, Shaq consistently posted some of the best defensive numbers of his career. In the 2000 and 2001 playoffs, he led the league in defensive win shares, and across all three playoffs, he consistently put up more than 2.4 blocks per game and 9 defensive rebounds. And remember, he was also contributing 28 or more points on the offensive side of the ball. Plus, this was the era where Shaq's weight really started to balloon. He'd play himself into shape during the regular season and then dominate the postseason. By fouling him so often, you are giving the most physically dominant big man in the NBA a breather on every possession. Sure, he has to deal with the pressure of hitting free throws, but you're pissing him off before giving him the chance to rinse your big man on the other side of the ball. Essentially, every time you foul Shaq late in the game, you're giving the best player on the court a free timeout to catch his breath. And that's just the start. Go look at the Lakers' defensive stats in the playoffs during their three-peat. It's not a perfect stat, but using stats.impredictable, you can see that LA was the best defensive team in the playoffs after a made shot. Seriously, if you give them time to set up their half-court defense, they're as close to unbeatable as it gets from 1999 to 2002. On the flip side, their transition or after turnover defensive rankings in the playoffs goes 11th, 8th, and 4th during that run. They're also a bit worse in after defensive rebound ranking than after made bucket. So, if you get them in transition, you have a better chance of scoring. How do you get teams in transition? Let them shoot and then quickly turn things around with a fast break. Or get a turnover, of course. What makes it almost impossible to get that fast break? Fouling Shaq. Not only are you giving this massive mountain of a human being a breather every time you foul him, but you're almost always letting the Lakers set up their half-court defense, making it even tougher for you to score. That's not all, though. Go look at the teams the Lakers played in the NBA Finals during those years and see if you notice anything. Do any of those big men outside of an aging Dikembe Mutombo stand out to you? Maybe Rick Smits? Other than those two? Absolutely not. But if you're going to employ Hack-A-Shaq, you need warm bodies to eat fouls. That means stacking your roster with bigs that can at least get in the way, if nothing else. Look, the NBA was in kind of a weird point in this era where there just wasn't anybody who could really hang with Shaq, but so many guys just had a job because they were big enough that he couldn't eat them alive without putting in some effort. That's cap and roster space that you could maybe use on a good player that teams just had to use instead to counter Shaq, and he's somehow unplayable? Please, do yourself a favor and go look at the 99-2000 playoffs. There were 2 games where Shaq shot more than 25 free throws, and the Lakers dominated. I'll give you that the Lakers were 9-6 in games where Shaq shot more than 10 free throws that season, but I don't think you can use that to say you have to take him out at the end of the game. In fact, if you look at the three-peat years, the Lakers were 27-9 when Shaq shot more than 10 free throws. Does that sound like a liability to you? This take that Hack-A-Shaq not only worked, but made Shaq into some kind of Achilles heel for the Lakers late in games has somehow become a popular thought among pundits, and it makes no sense, at least during his peak. See, Hack-A-Shaq did work later in his career, but he wasn't the player on either side of the ball that he had been before. Look at the 2008 playoffs when Greg Popovich used the technique with probably the most success it's ever had. Of course, Shaq was 36 and nowhere near the player he'd been in his prime. That said, the practice also has some utility when you're beating a team with Shaq on it. Sure, using it when you're down gives Shaq a rest, but using it when you're winning? Well, that means the lower percentage shot is actually more helpful. Yes, the clock is stopped, but Shaq is, on average, only earning 1 point every possession. That's not terrible, but it'd be tough for the Lakers or anyone else that Shaq plays for to claw back from a double-digit deficit that way. Personally, I'm convinced that the Hack-A-Shaq idea is the biggest psyop sports writers have ever pulled on fans. It just doesn't stand up to muster, and it never has. Talking heads just want a reason to talk down about one of the 10 best players to ever lace up his sneakers. Seriously, if you think Hack-A-Shaq worked, go watch the 2000 finals against the Pacers, particularly in Game 2, where Shaq took 39 free throws, and tell me it looks like Phil Jackson needed to take Shaq out at the end. Look, if you want to argue that banking on Shaq going 1 for 2 from the line instead of getting a guaranteed 2 from the field, I'll hear that argument, but anyone calling him unplayable at the end of games needs to have their head examined.